Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be focused on the iRacing INI files. Now, it has been at least a couple of months since I last released an iRacing how-to video, and this one in particular I wanted to get out actually in the summer of 2023. Now, the reason that I held off on doing that is because iRacing was making a bunch of changes to where these settings were stored from one INI file to another. So instead of making a video last year and then having to make edits or change it kind of a couple of months later, I decided to hold off, wait until the files look stable, and for the last couple of months, not a ton has changed in the INI files. A couple of things have been added, but nothing major, so now it seemed as good a time as any. So the focus for today, gonna cut this up into two sections. So first of all, I'll take you through a quick spin of what I think are the most valuable hidden settings that you can configure inside the INI files. So settings that you can't configure inside the user interface within iRacing and when you're in the sim itself. And then I'll just give you a brief overview of the key INI files, what settings are contained within each one, just so you have a general awareness of some of the changes that you can make. It's important to note most of these settings can be configured within the user interface when you're in the sim, and so that's obviously the easier option. But if you ever need to modify a setting when you're not running the sim, or as I said, you want to take a look at some of these hidden settings which are not accessible inside the user interface itself, it can be super useful to just get a bit of an understanding of what settings are where and what are the changes that you can make. Okay, let's get into it. So first of all, let me give you a quick orientation as to where to find all the different INI files for iRacing. So you're going to want to head to your main documents folder, then you want to head into iRacing, and then this is the typical iRacing folder structure, and then the INI files are down the bottom here, and the ones that we're going to focus on today are going to be this app.ini file. We'll take a quick look at the core.ini file, but there's nothing major for us to look at there in terms of settings and configuration. And then finally, we're going to look at the renderer DX11 monitor INI file. Now, important to note, this one, depending on whether you use a VR headset or whether you use a monitor, might have slightly different wording, but just know you're looking for the INI file which has renderer DX11 as part of the title. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to do was to take you through 5 of the key hidden configuration changes that you can make. These are changes that you can't make inside the sim itself when you're in the user interface. I think are great quality of life improvements, and they're not necessarily that obvious when you're scanning through the files. So let me take you through each one of those, what they do, and how to make that change. The first 2 will be in the app.ini file. So if you just double click that to get it open, if it doesn't open automatically, just select Notepad to open it, and then you should get to a screen like this. And the first of these hidden configurations is to do with the messages that are shown on screen whilst you're driving in the sim for players that are either joining or leaving the session. Now, this is something that I hadn't changed, to be honest, until about 3 or 4 months ago, when I was having some stuttering problems with the PC and was just having a few challenges at the time. And this was one of the settings that actually helped improve FPS and minimize some of the drops that I was having at the time. By default, these show join and leave messages are on, but it's a very easy setting just to switch off, and then it means you just don't get any of the messages when people are either joining or leaving the session, which, you know, for me adds no value. So I think it's, you know, a good thing just to turn off. So the way to find that setting, you can just do a Control F whilst you're in Notepad, and you can type in show, and then I'll just do show join here, all one word. And then you can see that's going to take us down into this miscellaneous section of the INI file. And mine is already set to 0. If yours is set to 1, then you'll know the setting is on, so those player join leave messages will be shown. But if you want to switch those off, very simple, turn that to a 0, make sure to do it, you know, delete the 1, turn it to a 0, save the file, and just make sure that you're doing this when iRacing is not running, because these INI files get loaded every time you start the sim. So if you're in the sim, then it won't pick up the changes automatically. You need to come out of the sim in order to make the change and then reload into the session. This second change is absolutely one of my favorites, and I didn't even know this was a thing, I think, until the summer of last year, and I can't remember how I found it out. I'm sure I caught it on another YouTube video somewhere. And this change is, if you have ever been either a team race or just when you're racing yourself, you're in a session, but you are parked in the pits and you hit escape to come back out of the session. By default, what iRacing will do is it will wind time back by, I don't know exactly the time, maybe it's 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I'm not sure what the default is, but you effectively enter a replay mode. Now maybe that's useful if you want to see kind of the last 20 seconds of action. Maybe you crashed, maybe something exciting happened, but for me, I found this extremely frustrating, and even more so when I was in a team session. If I was doing an endurance event, I would forget that I wasn't live, and I'd be trying to spectate and to spot for one of the other drivers in the team, and I'd actually be 20 or 30 seconds behind where the action was. So I always found that frustrating. I had no idea you can change that, but you can. You can actually set either the delay into the replay, or you can clear it altogether, which I think is super useful. Again, we're in the app.ini file, so I'll get you to do a Control F, and the search one for this would be play, and you can just put in play second, and that should get us to where we need to be. And then you can see here that there are two settings, so I'm just going to highlight them here. And the full string here is play seconds from replay end on car exit. And then you have a non-team setting, and then you have a team setting as well. So you can actually change this so that if you're just in a non-team event, you could leave it as default if you're happy with it jumping you out into a replay. But then for the second setting there, if you are in a team event and you want to always be live when you get out the car, then you can make that change. So for me here, you can see I have it set to 0 on both. That is not the default, but how this works now for me is every time I escape out of the car, I stay live. So whatever my default camera is, it'll go to that, but I'll still be live in the session, and it won't automatically jump back out to a replay of 20 or 30 seconds ago. So this for me made a huge difference in my endurance racing. I loved it. It's a small thing, but again, something you can't configure when you're in the sim itself. So something you need to do offline in the ini file, save, then load back into the sim, and then you'll see that change. The next three settings are actually contained within the renderer DX11 file. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of my app.ini file. I'm going to take a look at the renderer DX11. Just as a reminder, mine says monitor, yours may say something different if you're using a virtual reality headset. Just look for the .ini file that has renderer DX11 in the file name. Once you've opened that up, the setting that we're going to jump to here is something where you can configure the physical size of the virtual mirror when you're in the sim itself. Now, inside the user interface, in the graphic settings, you can already configure the field of view for the virtual mirror, so no need to make that adjustment in here, although you can do it in the ini file as well if you wish, but that's easy to do in the UI. But what you can't do in the UI at the moment is adjust that physical size. And initially, it's kind of a fairly big, medium-sized mirror, I guess you could say. But especially for VR users, I know sometimes, having that a little bit smaller or bigger, depending on your preference, can make things a little bit easier. I run on a monitor setup, but even for me, once I realized I could make a change to the size of that mirror, I decided to bring it down just a little bit, really just personal taste. But the way to do that is in the renderer DX11 file that we have open here. So I'm just going to do a quick search, and if you just search for mirror, that's probably going to get to where we need to. I'll just scroll down for you here. So I'll just highlight this. It's pretty obvious what you can do here. So you can see on the left, you've got virtual mirror size. Mine is currently set to 2. The original would be medium, which is set to 1. You can go larger by putting a 0 in here, and you can get all the way down to extra small, which is a 4, which I haven't tried, but I'm imagining that would be pretty small. So again, minor change, but something that can be super useful if you just want to adjust that physical size of the virtual mirror, and you rely on that more than you rely on the actual in-car mirror for each one of the cars. The next setting is actually one I've covered in a previous video, and what it references is when you're in the sim, whether you're either in the car or you're in the pits and you're spectating. But if you hit Alt-K, you have the ability to drag and drop different user interface elements, things like the black blocks, etc. And that's great, so you can kind of customize, and you can even do it on a per car basis where those different UI elements are on the screen. Super useful, but unless you switch this setting on, you only get to see the active ones when you hit Alt-K. By hitting this setting, and we'll go there in just a second, it allows you to see all possible UI elements when you're in the car or out of the car, so that you can drag and drop them to where you want. So super simple, but again, not something that everyone knows right away when they jump into iRacing. The name of this one is Force Visible When Moved. So again, I'll just do a force visible search there, and then hopefully you can see again, it's pretty easy. So force visible when moved. So for me, it's already set to 1, so that means that I can see all of those UI elements. And then you can see in the description, force all movable controls to become visible when moving UI elements. So something small. Most of you will probably know that already, but if not, this is a way for you to see all of the possible UI elements, and then allow you to drag and drop them after you've hit Alt-K when you're in the sim, either in the car or in the pits. And the last one I have for you, probably not one you're going to need all of the time, but I find this setting extremely useful if I am running a new CPU, a new GPU, or I'm adjusting graphic settings and I want to get a sense, during a race when I've got a full crowd, just how taxing the changes I'm making are going to be on the overall performance of the sim. You'll know that if you're in a test session, by default, the crowd doesn't show up. So therefore, if you're trying to test graphic settings, not only do you not have a whole bunch of other cars that you can test against, unless you kind of set the UI and you bring them in, but also the crowd isn't there. So you're not really testing the system as it would be tested during a race scenario. Now, of course, you can do a race to simulate that. But if you just want to have a test session and you want to get a sense of what's the pull on the CPU, GPU, when you've got a full crowd, and just to play around with that in the graphic settings, there's actually a setting right underneath here, actually, as you can see, where you can force the crowd to show up in the grandstand during practice and or qualifying sessions, which is super useful. So for me, this is set currently to the default value of 0, because in general, that's not what I want. There's no need for me to have the crowd there when I'm just kind of rolling around in a test session. But, probably 2 or 3 months ago, when I was adjusting some graphic settings, trying to squeeze a bit more out of my PC, I would switch that to 1 just to get a feel for when I change the settings in the crowd, what is the impact on the performance of the PC. So just a small one, but again, something quite useful when you're setting up, configuring, and trying to get the maximum performance from the PC without having to test it in a fully fledged race session. Let's move on to more of a general tour of both of these .ini files, and we're going to start off with the app.ini. So I'm going to double click that so you can see what I'm looking at here. I'm not going to talk through every single line item in here, as it would take a long time, and actually the descriptions next to each of these settings generally are pretty good. I'm just going to highlight what each of the sections contains, maybe flag a couple of the interesting ones as we go through, just so you understand where you should be looking for a particular configuration, whether it's in the app.ini file or whether it's in the renderer DX11. So right at the top here, the first section is adaptive, and it's pretty self-explanatory, really. Got a couple of settings, whether you want the pit line to always be visible, and the width of the racing line, if that's something that you use. So pretty easy. The next section is a long one, and it's a huge amount of audio configuration that you can do. Now, a lot of this configuration you can just do right within the sim itself when you're in a session, so that would be my recommendation. But if for any reason you're looking to do something specific, something that you can't find whilst you're in the sim itself, and you can't find it within the options in the sound tab, this is the place to look. So the app.ini file, have a look at audio, and then you can see a whole bunch of settings here. You can set the loudness, brightness, for the ambient, for the crash, for the engine, in-car, LFE, etc. So huge amount of different things and customization that you can do. You can override the voice chat rate, you can adjust the sample rate, but my recommendation, to be honest, is unless you know specifically the setting that you're looking to change here, I would do all of the work inside of the UI, as for me, I've not had to make any additional customization to the audio outside of what I can do within the user interface when I'm in the sim itself. The next section we have here is the auto chat messages. Again, pretty self-explanatory. So these are automatic chat messages you can just hit with a keyboard shortcut. I don't tend to use these, but could be quite useful. So you can see mine are all set here to the default settings that iRacing comes with. But if you use text chat and you want to program some of the messages, then this is the way you do it. And you can see it's pretty simple. Auto chat STR1 all the way through to 15. So you can put in quite a few messages. And indeed, as part of the auto chat, you'll notice here some of them have got a hashtag in front of them. And that is actually to enable you to put in commands to iRacing to change tires or to add certain amounts of fuel. So that can be useful, as well as obviously just using the chat messages to communicate to other drivers. BassShaker Settings. These is everything here you can do in game itself. So again, recommendation wouldn't be to make any changes in here unless you're having struggles with something in particular inside the settings. And I think the BassShaker settings are in the MISC tab inside the sim when you're in options. Camera tool, a whole bunch of stuff in here, and again, you can do a huge amount of camera tools and camera controls when you're inside the sim itself. So same recommendation, start there first, but if for any reason you're looking for a setting, can't find it, have a quick look here just to see if what you're looking to do is possible within the iRacing settings if you can't find it inside the sim. If we carry on down, we get the drive screen settings. A couple of useful things in here, which black box to display by default. I think I've customized this. I can't remember which one it is, but it says -1 for me there. Again, this is a setting I'm pretty sure you can configure when you're in the sim. So start there, but just know you can also do it here. The black box to display when you're in the pit stop can also be useful. Mine's set to 0, so it doesn't look like I've adjusted that. And then, a whole bunch of other things that you can do on the drive screen. So again, the instructions here are fairly clear in terms of what each of the settings does, so you can take a read on your own time. External displays, I have not made any changes to this. Just looking at this here, I'm not sure if it's specific to Logitech or not, but my recommendation, probably don't head into here and make changes unless you know the specific setting that you're looking to adjust. Force feedback. This is interesting. Plenty of this can be done within the UI, but I think there are a few things in here which are not settings that are surfaced inside the UI itself. So something you can come and take a look at. You've got force noise suppression example here. So if I just kind of highlight this one for you. So you can remove a noisy joystick axis, even if it's something that's been calibrated by hand. You can force a reset of the whole force feedback system every time, we create or destroy a force feedback effect. Not something that I would recommend, but if you're struggling with force feedback for any reason, this could be something that you switch to 1 just to see if that helps you. But anything to do with force feedback, any of the additional hidden settings can be found within this app.ini file. Worth taking a look, can be useful. I think one of the things that I probably adjusted right when I got the game was this very last one, and this is around the steering force when parked. This is a setting that you can see and set up within the UI itself, but here you can be a little bit more specific around what that reduction in force feedback force is, and it looks like mine is set to 0.33 here, and in particular that can help with oscillations when you're going at a slow speed and typically when you're in the pit lane. So lots that can be done, but again, a lot of the force feedback work can be done inside the sim. This would be additional tweaking or making changes that you can't find in the sim itself. Let's continue on down. So this one is an interesting one for anyone that is running overlays, RaceLab specifically. You most likely will have come across this before, and this is used if you need to limit the amount of cars that are transmitted to your PC. Typically you don't want to do that, so mine is set to 63, which from memory is what RaceLab requires in order to get live timing. But my understanding, or at least when I started with iRacing a couple of years ago, that this isn't set to 63 at default. So if you have RaceLab, you probably know all about this, and if not, this will help any of your overlay programs be able to pick up live timing. If this is set to anything lower than 63 or lower than the number of cars that are in your particular race, then you won't get the live timing updated. It'll update as you go past the start finish line every lap. So on we go here. This looks to be a new one, probably for when rain is going to drop, this show weather radar. So for me it's set to 0, but I imagine once we have rain and a change in weather, this will be something that might be interesting to switch into the 1 position. This miscellaneous section here, some of these are quite useful. We've already covered the show, join, leave. So the player join leave messages. There are some other things you can configure. I'll just show you these 2 bottom ones. So whether system messages are going to show whilst you're driving, I dislike those, so I've turned those off. And whether you want to show user chat messages while driving, again, I have turned those off for me. So I think from memory, these are both things that you can configure within the UI. But if not, or you're not sure where to find them, just know you can head into the app.ini file, into the miscellaneous section, and you can make those 2 changes there. This pit service block, quite useful. Whether you want auto fuel to be enabled by default, I think this can be set in the UI, but if not, you can do it here. The number of laps of safety margin to use by default, I've played with this hugely over the last 6 months, and I've actually now decided to set it at 0 because I generally find iRacing overfuels me otherwise. And then these last 2 are whether you want to automatically request the fast repair once your vehicle exits pit road, and then also if you want to request a full pit service once your vehicle exits pit road. So quite useful, these 2 elements, and something that you might not be aware of. Okay, we now have a section on replay. I think the only one I've really changed here would be this first one, and it's whether you want to ask whether you want iRacing to ask you to save the replay when you quit out of the sim. You can change it in here, but you can also set this inside the graphics or the replay graphics settings as well. So either way, and again, any other of the more specific replay settings that you can't address inside the UI, you can come here and you can take a look at those. The setup auto load, I'm not exactly sure how this works. It probably remembers a setup that you've got on specific cars. So if you cleared this, obviously, then it would just probably load the baseline setup. I haven't made any adjustments here. This is iRacing just making changes on my behalf, probably based on setups that I'm running. So not something I'm too worried about. But this next section, I have spent a little bit of time in because I use the iRacing spotter. So if you're using a third-party spotter like Crew Chief or something else, then you don't really need to worry about this section. But if you are using the iRacing spotter, there's lots of interesting adjustments you can make in here. And because the settings to configure the spotter are relatively limited, actually, inside the sim itself, this is a great way to understand just the customization that you can add to that spotter beyond what you can see in the UI. Some of the things that you can do in here, let me just highlight this for you. So the precision in terms of lap times for when you're going through, this is set to 2, which I think is going to bring me down to the hundredths of a second. Can't remember exactly, but you can adjust this kind of 0, 1, 2, 3, I believe. and then you can kind of read a lot of these settings yourself. But report when a new in-class best lap is set, report a lap time of in-class best lap of the session, report when a new personal best lap is set in practice or testing, but also in a race session. So there's all sorts of additional customization. So if you use the iRacing spotter, this is really useful, just to make sure you're getting exactly the information that you want from the spotter in the right way that you want it. And as I said, the settings that are inside the iRacing UI are pretty good for the spotter, but they are limited and they're nowhere near as detailed as what you can configure in this INI file. So definitely worth taking a look. So these next few sections, I'll just highlight them. These are things that you can configure within the UI itself when you're in the sim, so I'm not going to worry too much about these. You can get a bit more specific with certain things here. I'll just show you this ghost car offset, ghost car transparency. So if you want to really kind of fine tune what the ghost car looks like, and if that's something you use to better your lap times, then you can do a bit more fine tuning in here. But in general, a lot of this can be set within the UI. But just know, this is all to do with the splits and the deltas, and then this one underneath is really the system meters that you can see whilst you're driving or whilst you're in the pits. But again, these can be configured whilst you're in the sim itself. Tilt drive and touch drive I don't use, so I'm not going to talk about those. Same with True Force. And then this last section looks extremely complicated, but all this really is if you have ever customized the UI elements that are, either when you're driving or whilst you're in the pits, this is just a record of what all of those changes are. So super important if you ever reinstall iRacing. I mean, a good practice is to back up your entire iRacing documents folder, but it's always really important to back up your INI files, the app.ini and the renderer DX11 INI specifically, because it's going to retain a lot of those configuration changes that you might have made. And so I know here I have a custom UI elements offset for a whole bunch of things when I'm in the car, and this is basically the full list, and this is telling iRacing where I want all those specific UI elements in general when I start the sim. And on top of that, you can now also save UI elements on a per car basis, and that creates actually a separate file that sits inside the car folder, so outside of this, which is super useful as well. Just to close out the app.ini file, if we scroll down here, just a couple more sections that are worth taking a quick look at. So if you're screenshotting or doing video capture from within iRacing, there's a couple of settings here that you might find useful. You can adjust the screenshot file format. The default is PNG, but you can change it to JPEG or to BMP as well. You can adjust whether you disable the loading of the video capture module. You can adjust whether you capture audio from your microphone and not just from within game as well. And then you've got the video encoder options as well. Do you want it to be saved as an MP4 file, WMV, AVI file, etc. So it can be useful if you use that functionality. I don't use it too much, to be honest, as I just pull from my streams, but good to know that it's there. Here you have a whole bunch of settings related to view, so pretty much when you're in the car. I'm not going to go through them in detail. You can adjust the virtual mirror FOV right at the bottom here. This is something you can also do in game, so not too much to worry about, but you can fine tune basically a whole bunch of settings around the cockpit look angle, the cockpit look dead zone, etc. Unless it's something that you know what you're doing, I wouldn't make any changes here. But if you're looking to really customize the view, obviously this is the space that you're going to take a look at in the app.ini file. And right at the bottom, obviously this is the developer use only, so not any changes that you want to make in there. So that's it for the app.ini file. So let's head over to the renderer DX11. So I'm just going to come out of here. And then let's jump back into the renderer DX11. Mine has monitor at the end. Yours may be different depending on whether you're using a VR headset. But we're going to double click that and off we go. And then this file, it's not quite as long. If I scroll down, you can see here we've got graphics options, and that's the bulk of it. We've got a few things around drive screen, user options, display, monitor setup, etc. And then the replay graphics at the bottom. And just like the app.ini file, many of these settings can be set when you're inside the UI. But let's just chat through the sections so you have an understanding of what's where and what are the additional customizations that you can make here. The first section in the file is all to do with graphics options. As you can see here, it is quite a complex list, but the good thing to note is almost all of these can be configured inside the UI itself, so when you're in the sim. And that's great because there's a little bit more help in terms of tooltips for what the different settings do and how they can impact performance. I also did a graphics optimization video in the spring of last year. That is probably your best bet to get a better understanding of what all of these individual settings do in the sim, the ones that really push the graphics fidelity, the ones that cost a lot in terms of CPU or GPU performance. So because of that, I won't go through all of these individually, but I'll link to that video in the description. So if you want to go and take a look at that, it's a pretty handy video just to get a sense of how to maximize the performance of the graphics for iRacing on your PC. But if we head on down so that we can get to some of the other sections in this file. So we already talked about the virtual mirror size. So just a reminder is that setting is inside this renderer DX11 file. And this is where you can find it. Mine is set to 2. I prefer a slightly smaller virtual mirror than the standard size that iRacing has. Section after that is all around user options. You can adjust the UI transparency. Mine is not been adjusted, so it's set to 1. You can let the triple-headed session UI expand to fill the full display if you want. You would set that to 1. And there's a whole bunch of different settings that you can adjust in here, including the 2 we covered at the start of the video around force crowd visible and force visible when moved, to do with the UI elements. So basically this is quite useful if you just want to adjust the look and the feel of the UI when you're in the session. You can do some additional customizations in this ini file. Heading on down to the display section. Just like the graphics optimization video, I did a video last year which focused on how to get triple screens set up natively in iRacing, and this would have been the section of the ini file that I spent a little bit of time on. So just as a reminder here, I'll just highlight the key settings. You know, if you're looking to run triple screens natively in iRacing, there's a couple of settings that you need to adjust here. Now this is set up for my particular triple screen setup, and it may not be the same as yours. You would need to have the same monitor resolution of me, which is 2560 by 1440. But if you're running a 1080 setup or 4K setup, then these values won't be the same. But the settings that you would come in here and adjust would be confirm the height of your window on your monitor, so 1440 for me. Confirm the width of the triple screens in total, which for me is 7680. And then this first setting here allows you to tell iRacing basically where the top left corner is when you're in windowed mode. And if you're running a triple screen setup, you effectively need to tell iRacing to move the window over a screen to the left, which is why this is minus 2560. So this is a super useful set of options basically for your native triple screen setup. Continuing on down to the monitor setup. This can all be configured inside the graphics options within iRacing when you're in the sim, so I won't go through this in particular detail, but if for any reason you want to make adjustments and you don't have the sim running, then you can of course come in here and make these changes. Again, an important section if you're running triple screens to make sure it is accurate, but because you can do this inside the sim itself, you know, this is probably a less important piece of the ini file for you. Debug section, basically don't touch, pretty simple. Not too sure about this laser scan section. I've never made changes and I'm not entirely sure what it refers to, but if you know, feel free to let us know in the comments. And then finally, just like we had at the top where we had the graphics options, basically at the bottom is more or less a mirror of that called replay graphics. But just like the graphics options, these are configurable within the sim itself. Probably a lot easier to do it directly in the sim when you're in a session. But if you want to make adjustments when you're outside of that and you know specifically what you want to change, then you can come into the renderer DX11 file and you can make those changes in here. So I'm not going to really get into any particular details here. I think some of the ones that I might have adjusted are probably at the bottom here early on in terms of the max cars to draw in mirrors, the max cars to draw in total. But again, these are changes that you can make inside the sim itself, so it's pretty easy just to do it whilst you're running the sim. Okay, so let's talk through the remaining configuration files that you find within the iRacing documents folder. Most of these you really shouldn't ever need to touch, but it can just be useful to know kind of what's in here. So we've gone through app.ini. There's a camera configuration file. Basically, all this is doing is iRacing is just remembering if you have specific camera setups on a per car and a per track basis, then it will remember and put that in this list. I don't typically do that, so you can see pretty much all of mine are set to be blank here, but that's what the camera file does. This controls.cfg file, again, if it doesn't open first time, just use Notepad, and then you can see that. This is not an editable file in Notepad. It will at least open, so you can take a look at it. But effectively, what this is doing is this is your default controls mapping. Again, this is something you want to configure in the sim itself, but just know anything where you configure which button on your wheel is assigned to which command. This is the file that it's saved in, so super important if you're reinstalling iRacing. You know, ideally take a copy of your entire iRacing documents folder, but all of these configuration files will be key, and that controls one will help the system remember what button is mapped to what control when you're in the car. The core.ini file, I will open that really briefly. I've never had to do anything in here other than when I was having some fairly challenging stuttering problems towards the end of last year, and I was on the iRacing support forums getting some help and doing some adjustments to try and improve that and get rid of the stuttering. Other than that, I've never needed to come into this file, so I wouldn't recommend coming in and making any changes. It would really only be if you're struggling with something in terms of system performance and you've got specific guidance from iRacing to support to make a particular change here. Fuel data. This is iRacing logging kind of your fuel consumption and fuel data for different cars on different tracks. Again, should never need to make any adjustments here. It's just iRacing keeping a log of that, so super easy, so no real changes or adjustments to make here. And then the final file is actually a really important one, this joycalib file, which I'm sure stood for joystick collaboration back in the day. Now, this is only important when you are reinstalling iRacing, reinstalling Windows, but basically the initial configuration you do with your wheel and pedals when you get into the sim for the first time, this is where that information is stored. For me, I like to have a particular dead zone on both my brake pedal and my accelerator pedal, and what I don't want to do in between doing a reinstall of iRacing is lose that, because obviously that familiarity kind of helps you, stay fast, keep your consistency. So this joycalib file saves this, and this is the general one. There's also joycalib files that are stored on a per car basis, which I'll show you in just a second. But it's fairly simple. You can see here I've got my HE sim pedals, and this sort of the ID, the hardware ID of the pedals. And then you can see here I've got a Z-axis, a Y-axis, and an X-axis. They each are aligned to either pedal, brake, or clutch. I can't remember exactly which is which, but that's why there's 3 axes there. And then you can see my wheelbase here, the Podium Wheelbase DD1, hardware ID underneath it. And then here, basically, you've got the axis 0 and axis 3. This is basically the steering wheel. You know, it is configured in terms of the rotation of the wheel from one side to the other. So this is not a file you should ever really need to modify or change these numbers to, but it is a really important file to back up if you ever need to reinstall Windows or iRacing, because it will save you time in terms of having to reset up your pedals and your steering wheel, and it will also remember the dead zones. The only thing to bear in mind is when you do a reinstall, this UID will change. So what the sim will do is create a brand new joycalib file, and then you'll need to just bring over these old values, enter them into the new file that iRacing creates when you kind of set it up for the first time, and then you'll be good to go. And then the feeling that you have in the pedals should be exactly the same as you had before. If you want to know where the individual joycalib files are stored, as I said, this one will be the general file that it will apply to all cars. But when you tick the box when you're setting up a car in the sim that says, you know, specific to this car only, then iRacing creates separate joycalib files just in case you want to set things up differently. So where you will find those, if you head into setups, and I'll go into a car I'm driving a lot at the moment, the R8 Evo 2, and then a whole bunch of stuff in here. You can see some of my setups that I've been using. You can see the mirror settings is in here. You can see the controls, even if I have specific controls set up for a particular car. Again, this is where iRacing will store them. But here there's that joycalib file. So if I open it up, it's going to look identical to my general one because I have it set exactly the same for every car for that consistency, like I said. But just know there's often 2 versions of this joycalib file. Or multiple versions, as I say. The one general one in the main iRacing documents folder, and then you get one on a per car basis if you have set up specific controls for each car in the sim. That's all I have for you on this one. Making changes to those ini files is not something you're going to do on a regular basis, but I found it super useful over the last couple of years to just build an understanding of what settings exist where in those ini files, and most importantly, which are the configuration changes that you can make which you are unable to make when you're inside the UI in the sim itself. So hopefully the video has given you a few hints and directions on those. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next one.